Right, cool. And I'll hand it back over to Alex.
All right. So we're going to have the rest of this lecture talking about two final problems that we might face with thought experiments. So we'll go through them and I'll let you go. So we saw this problem of variation in judgments, a kind of similar issue that we might have with thought experiments that we've kind of seen come up a little bit already, is that they're too simple in a way, right? They're so short, you need some more information about them in certain cases. They're kind of describing cases in such vast detail that you kind of don't really know what you think about them when you first see them. And so the worry is that our judgments about these kind of really abridged short thought experiments might differ from those we would have towards like similar actual cases. They're so short that it's kind of hard to really get a grasp of what's going on. And so Daniel Dennett has called the use of thought experiments, they sometimes play this role of being kind of intuition pumps. They kind of pump your intuitions. They push you in a certain direction that maybe is not the right direction to go, right? They push you towards making a certain judgment that actually is incorrect. So just as a kind of case study of this, I'm going to talk about this thought experiment called Ticking Bomb. And so the idea is this. So in ethics, people wonder about the ethics of torture, right? Would it ever be permissible to torture someone? Should we completely ban torture? There are certain cases. And the setup of the thought experiment regarding torture is this, where the only way to save very many people from a kind of impending terrorist attack is by torturing a captured attacker. Right? This is the only way that we're going to stop this attack. And if we do so, the idea is that, well, we'd be guaranteed to obtain the information to prevent the attack. The question is then, well, in these really extreme circumstances, is it permissible to torture the attacker, right? To save very, very many lives. And again, there can be, I think, some interesting disagreement about this, but people tend to think that, okay, well, in these really extreme circumstances where it's going to save many lives, it's the only way to get the information, maybe in those circumstances, it would be permissible. At least in principle, right? Torture would be in principle permissible. Now, maybe these circumstances never happen, but at least in principle, and it can't be kind of absolutely ruled out as we might want to. But here's the worry, right? Is this clause here, where the torturer would be guaranteed to obtain information to prevent the attack. Now, we might worry here, right? I mean, so in this setup of the thought experiment, we can just stipulate that, oh, well, the torturer would be guaranteed to obtain information. But real cases are never like this, right? I mean, sure, in our idealized thought experiment, we can stipulate whatever we want. We can say it would be guaranteed. But in real cases, in fact, torture is often ineffective because it's not guaranteed to obtain true information. And in fact, victims often provide false testimony to end the torture. So, as in the example here, the mouse is saying they're a dog when being tortured, right? So torture is in fact highly ineffective and is never guaranteed to obtain true information. And so if we relied on this thought experiment to kind of make judgments about the morality of torture, of actual cases of torture, we might be misled, right? Because we'd think, oh, well, if torture is guaranteed to provide information, then maybe that's okay. But this never happens in actual cases, and so this thought experiment is kind of misleading in a way. It presents things as kind of overly simplistic, and as a result, we can be misled into drawing conclusions that don't really apply to the actual cases, right? So there's a lot of discussion in philosophy about these kind of perfect cases of torture, but we might be very skeptical about the extent to which any judgments about these kinds of cases apply to any real cases. So I think there's a similar concern about the kind of limits of our imaginative abilities when engaging with thought experiments. So just now we saw that one problem is that thought experiments are sometimes so short that they kind of miss out important factors, or they kind of switch things around a bit, they change things from real cases. A kind of similar-ish issue is that some thought experiments are just like so hyper-detailed and hard to keep track of that you just don't know what you think about them, right? So as a kind of crazy example of a thought experiment that's very hard to understand what's going on and form judgments about, I've got this example from the personal identity literature, right? So personal identity is all about kind of, well, if this, that, and the other happened, would this still be you? A bit like the ship of Theseus stuff, but for people. In this literature, when people are thinking about personal identity, they use all of these kind of really concocted, crazy science fiction scenarios where, oh, well, if you did this, so I briefly mentioned the teletransporter thought experiment earlier, where you get beamed up to another planet and your atoms are all reassembled. That's the kind of stuff that people love in personal identity literature. And so as an example of a kind of example like this, I found this. I won't name who it's from, but I find that like these kinds of things are very hard to keep track of. So here the idea is one of my half brains may be gradually both bisected and fitted with radio transceivers at the opening interface. You kind of split the brain, so at each stage we bisect one largest brain part, and then we have half brains, and then we split into quarter, and then eighth brains, and then we've got 3/4 brains all communicating. But eventually we get this case where each neuron of my present brain is in a supportive dish of its own in isolation, and it's hooked up to a device that is a communicator, and then that every brain part's then moved, and the question is, would I exist? And I'm like, I've got no idea, right? I don't know. I've got no idea what's going on anymore. So these are the kinds of thought experiments that you might be quite skeptical about their use, because it's just so hard to keep track of what's going on that, you know, if I think, oh, I would still exist when I'm scattered with every neuron of my brain a few miles apart, separated by radio transmission, I don't know. It's hard to place much weight on opinions towards these kinds of overly complex thought experiments where it's kind of tricky to know whether your judgments are reliable or not. Now, maybe we feel this way about some of the previous thought experiments I've talked about as well. But I think hopefully the contrast is clear that this is a bit like too much to keep track of. And I think ideally a good thought experiment is kind of easy to digest, and we can have kind of quite clear answers about it. We don't have to kind of think about it too hard as we do here, where it's just a complete mess. So another case that's like this that is quite fun, I think. So is this short story from Daniel Dennett, which is similarly a kind of thought experiment, but written as a form of fiction, as a short story. And this is quite an interesting kind of similar science fiction-y type case that you might find interesting to have a look at as a use of a thought experiment, but in a kind of more extended form, but which is still quite digestible. You can follow along with it a lot more easily. But yeah, kind of an interesting, more extended thought experiment. So I'd recommend that if you're interested in a kind of longer thought experiment about personal identity that kind of does things a bit better, in my opinion. So the upshot, I think, from this issue that we've seen is that when we're kind of using thought experiments and trying to rely on our judgments towards them, we've got to be really careful that, well, these judgments translate to actual cases, as we saw in the torture case, and that we can kind of form reasoned judgments at all, right? We're not just getting confused by all this information that's being thrown at us in thought experiments. So I think, again, these kind of show us how we ought to use thought experiments, a potential problem that we might face, but also kind of how we might avoid it, right, by better employing thought experiments. Right. Are there any questions about this issue or the couple of cases I've talked about there?
Maybe just one thing to really say. Read the Dennett paper. It's hilarious. Like, it's really good. And it's worth noting that when he first gave it, it was a talk initially. And there's a certain point, if you read it, you'll realize he switches his voice. Like, he changed the way he spoke at a certain point during the presentation. And apparently it was really hilarious. People were not prepared for it. It's a good story. It's worth reading.
It's a shame I recorded that. Cool. And so just going to talk about this kind of final problem we might have with thought experiments, which is what I'm going to call kind of representational discrepancy. I mean, these are just labels I've invented, so don't worry too much. So we've seen some thought experiments kind of just present some scenarios, and you're kind of meant to make a judgment about them. Is the ship still the same ship? Some of the thought experiments we've seen, though, ask you to say what you would do or what you should do in a certain scenario, right? So the trolley problem says, should you pull the lever? The experience machine says, should you enter the experience machine? So there, you're not just kind of making judgments about some case, but you're saying, like, what should I do? If I were in that case, I should do this, I should do that. Axe murderer was the same. So one worry we might have about these kinds of thought experiments, and again, I think this is something that was kind of under the surface a little bit earlier, is, well, we might say that you should do this, or I would do this, I would get in the experience machine, I wouldn't get in the experience machine. But you never really know just making a judgment about some kind of little written case. And you might worry that our responses to thought experiments might be very different from how we would actually react if we were in those circumstances, right? So in the case of the trolley problem, it's very easy to say, oh yes, you should pull the lever, that's what you should do. But maybe it's a lot harder if you're in that situation to actually pull the lever, right? So you might say, oh yeah, I'd definitely pull the lever, I'm morally obligated to, no problem. But it might be a lot harder to actually do so. And so we've got a kind of similar worry about thought experiments where the way we respond to them when kind of written down on paper might be quite misleading, because actually if we were in those scenarios, we'd respond very differently. And that is kind of a better guide to the nature of morality than just what we say we would do. We say a lot of things. So we might be misled in this way. So the question is, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Then the case with the ex-murderer on the previous slide is the one that's harder to resist because maybe it's more intimidating, or should I see? Yeah,
so it's very easy to say, well, yeah, you should definitely lie to the ex-murderer, but yeah, again, maybe if the ex-murderer is like huge and towering over you, maybe you think you're a bit scared, and yeah, maybe again, there's a similar kind of discrepancy where you might say one thing when faced with it written down, but might actually respond differently. So yeah, I think that's a similar case. So yeah, we might wonder, is there a way of getting more accurate judgments about how we would respond in thought experiment scenarios? I mean, one option would be to kind of like recreate them, right? Like put people in a trolley problem, see what they do. There's some pretty clear ethical worries about doing that. Yeah.
Really use it in a virtual simulation.
Hold that thought. Another option is to get actors to do it, which is actually a similar kind of thing. Like we can kind of represent it without actually having it going on. But then you might still worry that, okay, well, if we know that they're all actors, it's still a worry. Yeah, exactly, right? So this is the problem, right? Is you've got a thought experiment which requires impending doom, but it's kind of unethical to actually put people in situations that have impending doom. So like, what do we do? But yeah, as you said, I think a really interesting way that, people have gone, especially kind of recently, this has been a big thing that people have done in philosophy and psychology, is to recreate thought experiments in things like virtual reality or other kind of computer simulations. I mean, the interesting thing here is that if you just have it on kind of like a flat screen computer, you might still worry that, oh, well, it's like the actor case. It doesn't look real. But the idea of using virtual reality where you have to put on the headset and actually put yourself in the situation is that this aims to kind of more accurately represent you being in the situation and thus be able to kind of get your responses to actually being in the situation. So kind of visually representing it adds a lot of detail. So we saw earlier, thought experiments sometimes are so kind of short that you can't really get a grasp of what's going on. But when you visually represent things, you might think that avoids some of those concerns, right? You've got a better grasp of what's going on. You don't have to just imagine it. It's right there in front of you. But yeah, I mean, virtual reality, what that adds is this kind of perceptually immersive display where it looks as if you're really there. And there's a lot of interesting work on kind of how our emotional responses in virtual reality kind of match those towards real situations, even when we know it's not real, right? You go into virtual reality, you know what I'm seeing is not real. But in a lot of cases, you still emotionally respond in ways as if it were. So one example that's quite funny is have any of you seen the kind of walk the plank example in virtual reality, where you put on a headset? And so imagine there's like a kind of plank in front of me there. I've got the headset on it. When I've got the headset on, it looks like there's a massive drop. I'm on top of a skyscraper and I would fall to my death. Now I know that I'm just in virtual reality. If I do this, nothing's going to happen. But the fact that it looks like I'm going to fall to my death means that people like freak out. They're like, oh, I can't move. right? So even when you know that stuff's not real, recreating it in front of their eyes can more accurately get the responses you would have to actually be in that situation. And so in the case of thought experiments, you might think virtual reality can play quite an interesting role in helping get our kind of more accurate judgments. And I think this connects up a little bit to some of the stuff you had that Gregor covered in his lecture about kind of digital methods of doing philosophy. I think this is a similar kind of example where we can use technology, and in this case virtual reality or other computer simulations, to make philosophical progress, to get our judgments about situations, which we can then use in philosophy. One other thing that I think is really interesting about VR in this case is that not only can you recreate what things look like, but you can also recreate the actions you have to perform. And so in the case of the trolley problem, for example, people might say, yeah, I would pull the lever, no problem. But getting them to actually have to pull the lever, you might think that kind of, again, more accurately recreates it. There's a variant of the trolley problem as well that some of you might have come across called footbridge, which is where instead of just pulling a lever, you have to push someone off a bridge, right, to stop the trolley.
Very satisfying.
And again, like people might say, yeah, sure, I would, I think that just killing one to save 5 is good, so I would push the person off. But if you're in VR and you actually have to push the person, again, you might think that could be harder. Yeah, you have a question? Oh, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. So the kind of interactivity of VR, again, can help kind of more accurately reflect our actual judgments and kind of get more reliable data on which to base our philosophical theories. Yeah.
I do think that for that specific example, it is a little different because I call it the fat man.
Yeah.
The fat man is not in immediate, not even in theoretical danger.
Yeah.
Before you push him from the trolley and he stops the trolley. But the single person on the other track is already in theoretical danger, just per chance that the trolley track is not in their direction.
Yeah, I suppose. Although, if the trolley's going straight and the one person is off to the side and the trolley would have to divert, I mean, they're kind of not in danger in the same way as the man, right, on the bridge. You think?
Well, I think there is a difference there because it is a place of calamity that could occur.
Well, I mean, it's dangerous to stand on bridges. The man's just standing there on the edge of the bridge.
He can push you off.
No,
You never know.
Fallen off, right?
Of course, yes, but I do think there's a certain difference there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's why these are different thought experiments. That's why it's interesting that there are 2 different ones, because you might think that you would have different judgments towards just the original trolley problem and this kind of variant where you have to push someone off. So yeah, I think there is something potentially significant there. But yeah, I think there's a risk as well in each case. Yeah. So one thing that I think is interesting about VR though is that it doesn't fully avoid the issues that we raised, right? So there still is a risk that we still might not react in the VR scenario as we actually think we would, right? And so, a lot of people do various unethical actions in VR that they would never do in real life, right? A lot of people behave differently on the internet to how they would in real life. The fact that it kind of looks real still doesn't guarantee that people are going to respond in the same ways, right? So that, in fact, the fact that people know that there are not really lives at risk might mean that they don't care about pulling the lever. They don't care about pushing them out of the bridge at all. Yeah.
What if someone sleeps and you put on a VR headset on his head and then he thinks he's in the VR world and then you set him up in like normal life and then in that situation. So he wakes up in his normal life and then boom, on the street when he goes to school, you know what I mean?
Or you could think he's still alive.
Yeah, okay, yeah, but then it would be more realistic. Or maybe with actors that you really set a situation up without the guy knowing he's going into an experiment.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But how long would it take to be? I mean, you would know right away, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Like if you really set it up, like right now, if you know my habits and you know I always walk to that spot to my car every Wednesday, and you know, okay. No, I mean a real life situation.
It's funny because actually you're talking about the like you would feel the headset.
Yeah.
That's actually a kind of claim that people have made in the literature as to why these sorts of scenarios are impossible. Because you would always at some point kind of feel the machinery on your head. It's worth noting that there are ways to kind of work around that as well. But you might think, oh, at some point there's going to be an indication. You mentioned the Truman Show, right? There's points when he starts like, why are you behaving like this? And he finds the cameras and the flaws start to kind of unravel. But you can get cases that are close to this. So are people familiar with the book Ender's Game?
Mm-hmm.
So the very end of the book, massive spoilers here. The very end of the book, Ender thinks he's been playing a kind of training simulation. And then they tell him, no, actually, you just committed genocide. You just destroyed these aliens and like completely blew up every single like one in the galaxy. You've destroyed their home planet. Their queen bug is dead. Cool. Good job, Ender. And he's like, holy shit, what did I just do? And what's fun is you can also clearly think of reverse Ender's Game situations where someone thinks they're playing, that thinks they're engaged in genuine kind of activities, but in fact, they're just playing the game. You would be really worried about the sort of people who would set that up, but it would be very easy, especially if it's something like controlling drones. So these are the sorts of scenarios that aren't just wild and crazy sci-fi, but we're really getting close to cases where we can play around with people, putting them in these kind of scenarios. So maybe not getting you through your everyday, but we can find cases where because of the way you have to interact with the world, it could be virtual, it could be real. We just play with the toys in the way.
You think about VR glasses, right? Because if you think about new technology, about microchips, which could also alter our perception. So you wouldn't feel any weight on your head waking up. So that could be.
That would be a solution. Now I'm scared.
Scary.
Yeah, it's all right. Elon Musk's got it sorted.
Oh, fuck.
Okay.
I do think that, of course, this is a controlled environment, which makes it very difficult. But outside of controlled environments, these experiments could, of course, take action. I'm not talking about Nazi experiments. It's more so, say people with schizophrenia or severe OCD, they can experience such theoretical occurrences, very lifelike, in their own heads, which leads them to be forced to make that decision in their heads, which they experience as if it were real, even though it is not at all, which could be quite horrifying, but it could be a way to actually immerse in these experiments, and I think that could be something very interesting to look further into, actually.
Yeah, definitely. Although the tricky thing is, like, for experimental purposes, is being able to kind of induce particular the same experiences in lots of different people. And so, yeah, I suppose the tricky thing there is like controlling which experiences people have. I mean, I think in all of these cases where you're kind of recreating things as real, there's lots of really interesting ethical concerns that arise, right? So the idea of like kind of like setting up a scenario where you've got actors like the Truman Show, where it kind of seems as if things are happening on your daily routine, for example. I mean, people might worry that by again putting you in these situations, even if we tell you afterwards that it wasn't real, right? You have to decide what to do in a trolley problem. Even if I tell you afterwards that it wasn't real, we might still worry about the psychological impact that will have on you, right? People worry about this for VR experiments a lot, right? So even if you tell people before it's not real, you tell people after it's not real. If you're showing them some really like distressing scenes, they have to make really hard, intense choices. You're going to worry about potential kind of effects on people lingering, right? And there's lots of cases where people report these kinds of traumatic effects from virtual events, even though they knew at the time that they weren't real. They can still be really psychologically damaging. So, yeah, I think like recreating things in these ways is a really interesting way of kind of presenting these thought experiments, but it doesn't just avoid the ethical concerns. Often it creates new tricky ones, as in the acting case. I mean, so a lot of a lot of quite interesting historical psychological experiments can't be performed these days because of ethical concerns, right? So one example is the Milgram experiments that I'm sure some of you will have come across, right? Where you get people to press a button to shock someone else, the experiment convener tells me to shock the person, and I'm like pressing the button and delivering what would be like lethal electric shocks to someone else, and I'm just doing it because the person's telling me, and the other person's just an actor, right? But you can't do this experiment anymore these days. This was performed back in the 70s or 80s when ethics in psychology didn't really exist. But a lot of these historical famous experiments you can't do these days. That relied on kind of, oh, it's fine because the person's just pretending. Well, sure, they're just pretending, but you worry about the effects on the participants from performing these actions. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting ethical questions about like, oh, well, the fact that it's just pretend, potentially still got ethical worries there. I suppose a kind of separate worry about some of these virtual recreations is that they look quite good for certain thought experiments, but for other ones, they just don't really work. So something like the trolley problem translates quite nicely into VR. You can put people in a situation, they can see what's going on, kill one, kill five, pull the lever, or push the guy off the bridge. Cool, sorted. But other things, so think about something like the experience machine, for example. Now that's a similar thought experiment in that it's like, should you go into the experience machine or not? But how do you recreate that in virtual reality? Right? I mean, the whole point of the experience machine is that you're stepping into a lifetime of experiences. So there's no way to really recreate that in VR in the right way. Various other thought experiments are quite tricky to create virtual versions of. In fact, typically the ones in ethics can be quite easy in a way to set up in this way, but often other ones like the experience machine can be a lot harder. Yeah.
Yeah, a question about this VR. I was thinking about games and shoot 'em up games.
Yeah.
You have a VR glasses, and then you shoot everybody up.
Yep.
What kind of ethical concerns are there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a lot of really interesting worries that occur in these contexts about. So one thing you might worry about is the effects on the play, right? So you might worry. This is a worry that a lot of people have around violent video games is that performing violent actions in virtual environments might translate to real violent behavior. Now, typically, the empirical studies on this say that there's no such connection. There's been a lot of work, especially in kind of America. The American Psychological Association has done a few quite big reports on this, and they typically find very no or incredibly limited connections, not between violent actions, but between kind of you play a violent game and maybe you think you kind of think a bit more aggressively afterwards. In a way, that's unsurprising. You find the same thing for sports, right? You play football and you're tackling someone, and 5 minutes after stepping off the pitch, you're still thinking a bit more aggressively. That's kind of by and by. I think there's other interesting questions about the extent to which something can be wrong, even if no one's actually harmed, right? So you might still worry about the ethics of performing some horrible actions, even though there's no one actually harmed, regardless of its effects. And there's a lot of kind of interesting work in philosophy on this. So if you're interested, one thing that kind of issue that philosophers talk about a lot is the so-called gamer's dilemma, which is really interesting on this kind of issue. The ethics of virtually performing actions, is that unethical in certain contexts? Is it always permissible because it's not real? So yeah, there's an interesting literature on this in philosophy and elsewhere. Cool. Any other questions on the VR stuff? Okay. Well, I think just to sum up then quickly, so thought experiments, I think we've seen, can be really useful tools in philosophy to do various things, right? So it's kind of hard to pin down what a thought experiment is and kind of single thing that it does. We've seen they can do a load of different things across a load of different areas of philosophy. I mean, they're particularly used in things like ethics, where it's like, what would you do in this situation? But equally, we've seen thought experiments in metaphysics about the ship of Theseus and the persistence of objects. We've seen them in the philosophy of mind about the nature of consciousness. We've seen them in the philosophy of language about how terms refer. the experience machine stuff around kind of philosophy of technology type stuff. They can be used across kind of any area of philosophy. And in some cases, they just kind of raise some interesting philosophical questions, but we've seen that they can also play a really important role in assessing theories, and that's often the way that people will use them as kind of counterexamples, as we've seen, or examples which show that a theory kind of gives the right predictions. They give us this data against which to test theories. We've also seen that there's various kind of issues we can fall into if we use thought experiments in the wrong way, right? So if we use kind of too abstract or complicated thought experiments, then maybe we can't rely on the judgments we have. If we use too short thought experiments, then maybe we leave out some really important factors. Even if we use the right length thought experiments, maybe we just respond to them completely differently to how we would actually respond to those cases. So there's a load of different worries we have about thought experiments. I've tried to indicate some ways that we can kind of try to avoid them. So in the latter case, by using VR thought experiments for certain types, that can be kind of one interesting way of doing it. In other cases, kind of making sure we're not leaving out important factors, like in the torture thought experiment, kind of knowing the facts about the effectiveness of torture and not just ignoring that when we give a too short thought experiment. So yeah, hopefully you will come away with this with a kind of better idea of the various uses to which we can put thought experiments and how to do so in a kind of responsible manner. Thank you.
Nice. So yeah, thanks Alex for that. So just as a kind of wrap up and to mention on the camera, sorry, that was to the camera in the corner. Again, what we're going to do next week is just going to be midterm review. So there's no more new material or anything. I'm literally just uploaded the midterm question list and have almost successfully finished the test vision questions. Got another email while I was listening there, so fun. But it should be all sorted this afternoon. And what we'll talk about next Thursday is, again, I'll tell you a little bit about the structure of the exam. We'll talk through a bunch of the sample kind of questions, answer any things that you guys might have with regards to questions or kind of hangover material we still have. Make sense? Beautiful. Thank you guys very much for coming. Have an absolutely lovely, lovely, lovely week. And yeah, we'll see you all next Thursday morning.
We hebben Nederlands toch?